Hi everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to attend my talk today. It's the last talk in this session, so I promise to keep it a bit shorter. So I'm Aleksandar Milenkoski, you can call me Alex as well. I'm currently with Sentinel Labs at Sentinel-1. However, I did this research while I was at Cybereason. So today we will talk about encryption tactics, techniques, and more specifically about the BlackCat ransomware, which is also very trending these days, especially. In the eyes of our community, there is a big shift in the trend now on the ransomware scene. So instead of doing full file encryption, ransomware operators turn to doing intermittent or partial file encryption. And even so, instead of doing file encryption even, there have been recent reports of ransomware operators, namely BlackCat affiliates, doing even file corruption. So there are mainly two reasons for this shift in techniques. So the first is time. So with intermittent encryption, ransomware operators need significantly less time to encrypt a file, and with that the whole system, right? And that is what we will discuss also today in this talk. So the less time they need to encrypt the system, the less are the chances that they will be detected and discovered and stopped in the process. So there is an obvious benefit there. The second reason is evasion. So with intermittent or partial encryption, ransomware operators can also evade detection systems that, for example, evaluate intensity of file I or file input-output operation, or systems that maybe calculate or evaluate similarity between two versions of a file, one encrypted, one unencrypted, or plain text. And with intermittent encryption, there is a possibility to evade such systems. So let's review some of the recent ransomware. As I mentioned before, this is a current trend now. It's also a trend that we covered very recently in a Sentinel Labs post. So let's review some recent, very fresh ransomware families that do intermittent or partial file encryption. So the first one is the agenda ransomware. As you can see, it implements several encryption modes, such as skip step, percent, and fast, which in summary encrypt either the beginning of a file or encrypt a file in kind of a stepwise fashion, right? Encrypt a certain set of bytes, leave a next set of bytes, plain text or unencrypted, and encrypt the next set of bytes, and so on, until the end of file is reached. So we have the play ransomware, also a pretty new player. What they do is they basically split a file, divide a file into multiple equal-sized chunks of a fixed size, and then they encrypt only a specific number of chunks depending on the total file size. We also have the Blockbuster ransomware. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. It was really trendy, especially a couple of months ago, a very new big player on the scene. So what they do, they also started to encrypt files in a stepwise fashion. And we have the quick ransomware, which is maybe the newest member in this group. We still haven't found a sample to analyze it. I still haven't taken a look at its encryption techniques, but we observed the author boasting on underground forums like how they do intermittent encryption, which is what all the cool kids are doing these days. And we thought, okay, fair enough, we will include it in this list. And finally, we come to the BlackCat ransomware, which is basically in the focus of this talk. So first, a bit of context info about this threat actor and the operation for those of you who may not have heard about it before. So BlackCat is in its essence is a ransomware as a service operation, right? And especially among the reverse engineer community, was known as the first ransomware to be written in the Rust programming language. That made it a bit painful for me to reverse engineer it, but it went in the end well. BlackCat or ALF-V as a threat group goes after pretty high-profile targets, especially, as I mentioned, it is past few months has been featuring in the news recently. If I remember, it was around mid last year in Germany, I believe, that they compromised an oil distributor and they forced Shell basically to reroute all oil supplies. So that was going on in the German media last year a lot, so that's how they became famous there. Also, as a threat actor, BlackCat is very, very adaptable. So they continuously re-innovate, refresh their attack or infection arsenal, how they infiltrate systems, and also how they encrypt files. We will touch upon the encryption techniques in a bit. They were also one of the first threat actors to directly threaten members of victims or employees of victim organizations. So that was kind of an additional oppression technique they applied among all of their ransomware as a service competitors. One thing that is specific about the BlackCat ransomware samples is this large configuration space. So once I took a look at samples when they came out, is what becomes immediately noticeable is this large JSON formatted configuration blob stored or embedded in the executable. So it contains a lot of configuration variables, as you can see. So in the context of this talk are relevant the file mode and the file cipher configuration parameters. So the file cipher parameter configures the symmetric encryption algorithm that the ransomware uses to encrypt files. So it basically can be configured to AAS or with hardware support, or to the fully software implemented ChaCha20. Probably most of you have heard about it. ChaCha20 is one of the most performant symmetric encryption algorithms that fully executes in software. And as with hardware support, the advantage is that it uses CPU features to speed up encryption, right? So in theory and also in practice, as we will discuss in a bit, IIS with hardware support should be the fastest symmetric encryption algorithm out there. So the file cipher parameter also supports this third option or setting, which is called best. And when best is configured, the BlackCat ransomware automatically switches between IIS with hardware support or ChaCha20, depending on the platform where the ransomware operates, whether the platform has the CPU support or the hardware support for IIS, for the IIS encryption algorithm. So the file mode parameter configures the intermittent encryption, different encryption modes that implement intermittent or partial encryption in different way, which we will cover next. So in summary, BlackCat supports 5 individual encryption modes and 1 combinatory, which combines a couple of these individual encryption modes, but we will come to that in a bit. So let's cover the individual first. So we have full encryption, which is obvious. I mean, when the full encryption mode is enabled, this ransomware acts as any other. It encrypts the whole content of a given file. Then we have head-only. So head-only encrypts only the first n bytes of a file. By the way, the parameters that you can see above n, y, these are all configurable through the ransomware operator, right? So as I mentioned before, the BlackCat ransomware, it's in its nature, it's very, very highly configurable, even to the tiniest bits. The dot pattern encrypts a file in a stepwise fashion. It's obvious. It encrypts every n bytes, then skips the next y bytes, encrypts again n bytes, skips n bytes until the end of file is reached. So we go now further. So they also support what they call smart pattern. And also what I forgot maybe to mention, all of these names are basically extracted as string resources. I extracted them as string resources from the binary. Right. There also, some of them are available in the help screen of the ransomware, but they are not that descriptive in terms of how they're implemented and how they actually operate. The smart pattern mode, what it does is it first encrypts the first n bytes of a file and then divides the rest of the file into 10 equal blocks and then encrypts p% of bytes into each block, right? So this is what the n and p parameters basically configure. And finally, we have the advanced smart pattern, which similarly to the smart pattern encrypts the first n bytes of a file, but then they split the rest of the file into b number of equal sized blocks, and then they encrypt p% of bytes inside each block. So as you can see, all of these encryption modes are pretty intricate, pretty detailed, right? And next we come to the auto mode, which is even more complicated. Right. So the auto mode is combinatory, means it combines the use of the full advanced smart pattern and the dot pattern individual encryption modes which I just covered. And it's combinatory in the sense that it applies and it configures also the parameters of one of these modes depending on the size of the file that is under encryption. And as you can see, the auto mode basically considers a very large, very wide span of file sizes that it handles differently when it encounters them on a system, starting from less than 10 megabytes, ending with larger than 1 terabytes. So this shows a pretty fine granular handling of individual files by the BlackCat ransomware when it comes to encryption and how it handles especially intermittent encryption. As you can see, we have the different encryption modes, but we also have different parameters for each individual encryption modes. If you recall, which I just mentioned, like the N, the P, and the B parameters, right? So that's pretty careful programming right there. One other interesting thing to note about the auto mode is the set of file extensions that you see here. So there's a set of file extensions that's hard-coded in the binary, but when auto is configured, enabled on a sample, and when the ransomware encounters a file with one of these extensions, the auto mode will always apply the full encryption mode, which means files with these extensions will always be fully encrypted. It won't go into this logic, like to check the file size if it's greater than or less than 10 megabytes, gigabytes, and so on, right? So I speculate, we all think that maybe the malware author, so the threat group, considers files with these extensions as mission critical to victims, right? As you can see here, we have Microsoft Office documents formats, PDF, RDF, right? SQL, we have database, images, and so on. Because one thing that's important with intermittent encryption, which I will cover also through metrics now, is that it leaves certain portions of the file unencrypted. So it would be a very bad situation for the attackers for they to partially encrypt a file from which the victims can actually extract useful information afterwards, right? Because the end goal is to corrupt, to destroy the file, so the victims can be a subject to threatening afterwards. So, as I mentioned before, I saw this whole, how much time they invested basically in the configuration modes and also in the intermittent encryption modes and so on. And I said, okay, then let's measure what kind of impact these different modes, or in summary, the configuration space of the ransomware has in practice, right? When they actually infect the system and when they run, what kind of an impact that has. So I considered 3 different metrics. As you can see, we have the data throughput, measured in megabytes per second, which is there are many ways to look at this or to interpret this metric. Some of them are, it measures, for example, the intensity of file I/O operations. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is the total encryption speed, like how fast the ransomware reads data, encrypts it, and writes it back into a file. That's basically the data throughput. The workload processing time is how much time the ransomware spends on encryption, or even better formulated on file processing, which means, as I mentioned before, like reading data from the file, encrypting that, and writing data back to the file, effectively corrupting the file at the end. And we have unencrypted content measured in percentage is the amount of file content that the ransomware leaves unencrypted. As I mentioned, partial file encryption always means that a certain portion of the files will be left as plain text in an unencrypted form. And I also consider files of different sizes between 50 megabytes up to 50 gigabytes. The reason for this big number there at the end is that I saw that the auto mode supports even handling of even larger files, larger than 1 terabyte. I assume this is meant mostly for database files and files of similar format. So here are some measurement highlights. I will present this very briefly today. Mind you, in the paper that is published and will be published in the proceedings, there are many more measurement results and charts there, so I will just briefly summarize today. So in this scenario, we measure the impact of using the asymmetric encryption algorithm with hardware support. That's the next generation instruction support right there, versus the use of the fully software implemented ChaCha20. If you recall, that was the file cipher configuration parameter of the ransomware that configures one of these 2. And we have also the best value that automatically switches between these two algorithms. The encryption mode was set to full, meaning that the files that we encrypted were fully encrypted, so there was no intermittent encryption here in play. For a file of 5 gigabytes, we observed an increase of approximately 51 megabytes per second when using the IIS with hardware support encryption algorithm, and a reduction of approximately 5 seconds in total time spent on encryption. Right? This shows that for relatively size of files of kind of a medium size relative what you consider a small size or large size file, there is a specific reduction in the time spent on encryption. For a file of 50 gigabytes, I recorded an increase in 53 megabytes per second in the data throughput of the ransomware, and a significant reduction of approximately 18 seconds in total time spent on encryption. So mind you, this is on a single file, right? We are not talking still about system. In the paper, there is also a summarizing result that's based on the ransomware running against a fully equipped system, right? Against the full file system of a workstation. So that's right there. It's a pretty significant reduction in local processing time. In local processing time, considering that the file is encrypted using the full encryption mode, right? So the file is completely encrypted there. So in this scenario, we measure the impact of using the auto encryption mode versus full. So just to remind, the auto was this complex if-then kind of a scenario that applies different individual encryption modes depending on file sizes. So for 500 megabytes, we recorded a reduction this time in around 178 megabytes per second in the data throughput. So this reduction is because auto actually does not process the whole file. If you recall, it applies either the dot pattern method, so that's why we have reduction in data throughput when compared to the full mode, which basically processes every single bit of the file. But then we also have reduction in the total time spent on encryption of approximately 1 second, 0.8 seconds. In this case, the ransomware left around 86% of the file unencrypted. So when talking about large files, if you look at the results for a 50 gigabyte file, we have a very significant reduction there in the data throughput of the ransomware, around 250 megabytes per second, and almost 2 minutes reduction in the time spent on encryption. So again, I will remind, this is for a single file, right? However, the ransomware left around 98% of the file unencrypted there. So where does it leave us, and what can we conclude for that, right? And I will remind again, in the paper, there are many, many more results. However, the main conclusion is this one, that the configuration space of the ransomware is highly impactful, and especially when we are talking about large files. So they can be, for example, database files or very large document files. And the configuration space is impactful across all of the metrics that we observed, so the data throughput, the total time spent on encryption, and also how much of file content was left unencrypted. And knowing this, where does it leave us as a security research community, right? So in summary, we are at a turning point, at a precipice. So obviously, the ransomware operators, they have found a way to shorten the time that they spend on encrypting a file once active on a given system. They have also found a way to evade certain detection mechanisms, whether mechanisms that evaluate intensity of file input-output operations, or mechanisms that evaluate similarity between the two versions of a file, one encrypted, one not encrypted. And I discussed the current trend at the beginning of this talk. They're obviously jumping on a bandwagon, all of them, especially the new joiners in that area. So they obviously know where they want to go. So what is with us? What are our options? So first thing first, infection prevention has been and remains an absolute priority for us as a community. Because if we can stop a ransomware before it executes, of course, we don't have to worry about all of the things that I discussed right now, right? We don't have to worry how fast it needs to encrypt the system, a file, or whether it can evade some file input-output monitoring system, for instance, right? So in that line of thought, it's also important to know that we as defenders, we have much more time to detect a ransomware before it executes than after. So for example, Mandian noted in 2022, it's even a newer report, that the ransomware operators have an average dwell time of approximately 5 days before they detonate a ransomware, versus the couple of minutes that a ransomware may need to encrypt a system completely. Right, so definitely the conclusion here is infection prevention is definitely for us a priority. But if we can assume that prevention has failed, and that happens in practice, we just saw a couple of talks today talking exactly about this scenario. Where are we in that scenario if we consider intermittent or partial encryption or even file corruption in play? So let's first talk about detection engineering. As I mentioned before, the file input-output profile of intermittent encryption is vastly different than full encryption. So that begs the question, how good are our current file input-output based detections, for instance? Is there maybe a need to create new ones? Also, what about CPU and memory performance signatures? So encryption is a process that leaves CPU and memory utilization footprint on the system, especially on the CPU side, depending on the encryption algorithm. Could there be a way for us to develop CPU and memory performance signatures for detecting or at least suspecting an intermittent encryption, or at least differentiate between intermittent and full encryption? Right? That's also a way to think about it. I know that academia has been making some progress in that area also historically. The current state in the industry, to be honest, I'm not so sure myself. Also in the direction of response. So we discussed that intermittent encryption is faster. Partial encryption is faster than full encryption. So could we also think about shortening the time that we spend on evidence gathering to bring a verdict and responsive action a bit faster, so we don't let the ransomware, once executed, destroy more files that we would like to? And especially how that counter interacts with a potential false positive rate in this game, right? Because always when we sacrifice on evidence gathering and rush to bring a decision to save on time, we always have the danger of generating AFPs. And finally, even threat intelligence. I mean, if we can assume that we can map a given partial encryption technique to a given ransomware actor, ransomware affiliate even, because we saw a lot of the ransomware that is sold currently on the market support different modes for intermittent encryption. So if we can map one technique to a given threat actor, and we can conclude that this threat actor, this specific affiliates favors it or uses it very often, can we use that knowledge to basically increase attribution confidence in certain scenarios or in certain investigations that we conduct, right? And even at a very high level, like if we better understand what partial or file corruption techniques are used there or will be used there in the field, can we also better understand the malware and the ransomware market in particular, and also estimate even how malware or ransomware design will go in the future, because there is obviously some change going on right now. So the points that I raised here, especially in the last few slides, they do not pertain, they do not relate only to ransomware, even to BlackCat in particular, right? But to all malware where the configuration space plays a very big role. It's very impactful on the way that the malware operates, and they belong in the same category. So that was all from my side. I'm open to any questions that you may have. So thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for questions, so don't hesitate. There's one in the front.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was really wonderful. I have a question on another concept that was that's also used in ransomware to improve performance, and I didn't hear you talk about it. If you just do a lot of calls to read file, then to encryption, and then write file, that's going to be really slow if you do a lot of calls. So what they also do is using the I/O completion ports. Have you checked those too?
Sorry, they also use, I didn't quite...
They also use I/O completion ports.
Yes, so the I/O completion ports as a method in my experience, I've seen it personally in the context of the Steelbit exfiltration tool, if you're familiar with it. Right, it's the exfiltration tool in the arsenal of the Logbit group. So that's mostly used for parallelization and speeding up in that way. You're fully right. Yes, it's a method, but I see it more as a parallelization technique than actual file input-output kind of activity, because the file I/O will always happen depending on from what source, right? But as a way to speed up things, definitely, yes, it's there.
Any more questions?
Thank you for the question, by the way. It was.
Don't be shy. I have one. Do you have information that when the malware affiliates are actually deploying the malware, are they using any of the speed up feature, or they just default to?
Yeah, we have investigated several incidents, and in particular of the BlackCat ransomware, and it came with pre-configured intermittent encryption there. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
And many of them, especially that what we consider to be rather, judging based on the TTPs and so on, like how they infiltrate the system, that we consider to be a bit less sophisticated, they especially rely on the auto mode that I just presented, because they consider it like the optimal mode that the developers or that their owners, right, provide to them.
Mm-hmm. There's another question on the back.
Yeah, hi again, sorry. There's been a lot of talk about relations between BlackCat in particular and other ransomware as a service operations, including and not limited to black matter and dark side. I wonder whether you have any opinion on that, given the jury's kind of still out on that one.
You mean about the current trend that I just mentioned?
The code, have you seen any code overlap between the two, or any relation?
Code overlaps. No, not at this point, but it's definitely a topic that I would like to explore from like in the future.
Thank you.
It's definitely on my research agenda. It's a nice point. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, then let's thank again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Alex,